since you deal with a lot of players' contracts, of course, have you in your lifetime as a sports lawyer seen any clauses that include a pandemic as a COVID-19 in the contract? Like, is there a stipulated clause for a force majeure event, for example, such as the one we are currently facing?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and interesting question, Christian. I think the basic position is, for the contracts that I generally tend to advise on in relation to employment contracts, at least, the standard template Premier League and EFL contract does not contain a force majeure clause. And that effectively means that if there is no force majeure clause, there are other types of, at least in the UK, England and Wales, particular legal doctrines, but I don't think everyone will want to hear all about these legal doctrines. I think the interesting and important elements to consider actually are what national governments are doing from a national employment perspective, what FIFA is doing from a supranational perspective, and the guidance that they are ultimately providing. And what we have at least seen in the Premier League, and I know that Dr. Urquhart will talk about this as well in his experiences across Europe, is the PFA, which is the Professional Footballers Association, which is the representative governing body for footballers. They, as one of the stakeholders, are liaising with the variety of other stakeholders, including the Premier League, national associations and clubs, to try and see, firstly, if there is a way to be able to either defer salaries, to be able to reduce salaries for this period. But ultimately, under English and Wales law, employment law, it is not possible to make unilateral decisions. They have to be done if there is a variation to an employment contract with the consent of the employees, and it is the same way with the consent of the players. And as you would have probably seen, I know everyone has their issues as well at the moment across lots of different jurisdictions, but there has been a strange narrative developing in the UK whereby politicians seem to be confusing topics and effectively requesting football players, as opposed to any other people in the entire sector and industry, to be taking pay cuts, and suddenly the spotlight seems to be shone on football players. So, obviously I'd welcome Dr. Urquhart's thoughts on this, but it's a strange time on a number of levels.
Daniel, I want to ask you, obviously in England, the situation seems to be very different than one in Spain or Italy, where there seems to be more of a collective approach to it. What are some of the best cases in England that you've seen in terms of clubs really taking the kind of leadership that I guess the fans want to see in these challenging times, and taking actions even before the likes of the FA, the PFA, and the EFL and the Premier League agree on?
So yeah, I've been talking about this quite a lot over the last few weeks with quite a lot of my clients and people in industry and journalists more generally. And I think where that there's been potential issue and conflict, especially when the PFA in the UK has occurred, is generally because I don't believe there can be a one-size-fits-all approach for everybody. And that is maybe part of the issue, is that we've seen particular instances where some clubs in the Championship, i.e. the league below the Premier League, have come to agreements with deferring wages. Others have actually managed to have agreements to reduce wages for a particular period of time. And some of the issues around that, and some of the reports and conversations that I've had, is, in effect, if you have one body representing all players, there are going to be lots of different fits according to particular circumstances of the club. Now, I completely agree with what Patricia says, which is, I think it is sensible to have a grown-up conversation between the players at the particular club, because each club's situation will be very different. And I think what players are very concerned about, one, is whether if there are profitable clubs that they are employed for, that actually this is just something which might just not necessarily help the non-playing staff, but will just reduce the club's cost base and make it more straightforward for them to keep on operating, whilst also There are obviously a number of clubs that are in significant financial hardship, and those individuals and those executives can have grown-up conversations again with the players, their representatives, etc. Now, what also complicates matters is there are, depending on which country the clubs and players are part of, and the tax and the salary and the particular employment schemes in place. Dr. Urquhart and I were talking about this recently, was there are particular protections in place. So in the UK, there is a scheme called furloughing, which effectively provides a safety net for anyone that would otherwise effectively be sacked because of, or there wouldn't be a job in place of letting that individual go, because otherwise you have a very, very difficult situation to handle, where a significant part of the workforce might be laid off. So this is the safety that is provided. Now, the query is whether very big and large football clubs should be taking advantage of those government shortfall, or rather government safety nets and subsidies, in order to put some of their staff, just like in other industries as well, into that protection situation. So it's not necessarily just a player and club matter. It's not necessarily just a national governmental issue. It's not necessarily just a national labour law and FIFA and jurisdiction issue. It is all of those different combinations all interplaying at a time when the truth is there are a lot more significant issues going on in football, but we understand that this is a significant industry, and hopefully when things start getting back to normal, the authorities just in sport and just across other industries need to have a plan so that the economy, which, you know, it goes without saying, has dropped exponentially, like since records began since the Second World War, needs to start recovering at some point.
Daniel, what's your legal opinion on how the situation might or will create legal precedent in the future? Maybe as soon as this next transfer window, will we see, and this is a question from Ryan, do you think future player contract will have clauses which cover situations like COVID-19? Do you think this summer automatically all contracts will suddenly have these types of clauses?
I think the short answer is that nothing like this has ever happened for the last 100 years. So it's sometimes very difficult to expect the totally unexpected. I think that's the first thing to always say. And back to your first question, Christian, it was sometimes you can have force majeure contracts which supposedly do cater for the unexpected when things can't actually happen. But I think the precedent that I think it should hopefully set is not really a legal precedent, but I think in some ways it's a practical matter, which is, if we imagine that the football industry really, apart from the national employment laws, is built around different regulations. It's built around national association regulations, UEFA or particular country or intra-country regulations, as well as then FIFA global regulations. And as a result of that, a lot of the different parameters that are so traditionally accepted within the game, I believe, need to be flexible. We need to have a pragmatic approach to deciding how things are run, and how things may work in the next 6 months to 1 year. Because I completely agree with Patricia. I think if the position has to be that because the economic losses are so significant from a broadcasting perspective, for example, and the communication from FIFA, UEFA, the national associations is that at the moment, the season is going to be continued indefinitely, in part from a financial perspective, but in part because of a competition element to ensure that the competition can be finalized. Then if we look forward, my view is that, again, that flexibility and pragmatism has to be managed in terms of when the season can be finished, when the transfer windows open, what happens to particular contracts, be it player contracts or sponsorship deals. It might be for the next 2 or 3 seasons. The season does not run like the seasons have run for the last 100 years, because we are in such exceptional times. So I think what is required is, I hear quite a lot of the time, even from my friends and otherwise, which is, we should just void the season and make sure the next season can start on time. My view is, apart from the very biased fact that I'm a Liverpool fan, and also because in other ways, I believe in a way that there should be some type of fairness, i.e. your performances and the team's performances across different divisions should count. And because if we talk about precedent, the types of legal issues that will no doubt arise if a season is voided, that I think clubs need to be very careful about the possibility of ending seasons early. It may work in some financial and beneficial interests for them, but ultimately what I think the football family needs to be doing is putting in place a process and a procedure and a framework, which can obviously be varied because they are the very creators of that framework, to ensure that in the short and medium term, the significant consequences of what is outside of everyone's control can be managed as effectively as possible. Because otherwise, if we live within our own boundaries of what we are used to, then nothing will change. Ultimately, this flexibility is absolutely crucial. But just very briefly, some of the things that I know that FIFA are talking about as well, that I'm sure Patricia and Philippe can talk about as well, which was, under English and Wales law, it's not possible to unilaterally extend the contract. If the player doesn't want to extend past the 30th of June, I cannot see a situation where FIFA are going to just dictate that must be the case. The flip side, though, and the practical flip side, is that if the transfer window hasn't opened for a free transfer agent and that player hasn't signed a pre-contract, I can't imagine there are going to be too many clubs that are going to be willing to take that player on and potentially incubate a couple of months worth of wages before they can register the player for the new league season, possibly, and not knowing when that would happen. So I wonder whether that is the incentive that the player has, at least for the short term, to continue playing that season. But it's the same with loan players returning. It's the same for transfer installments. It's this, all those types of timing issues are very important.
Daniel, you mentioned FIFA a number of occasions before. What's your anticipation of the transfer window mechanism, right? Obviously, across Europe, a lot of countries have a very similar window. But in light of COVID-19, may well be that certain countries have to wait a lot longer until they can actually finish their season, and as such start doing transfers. What do you suggest, or what would you do if you were at FIFA deciding right now on how to establish the next transfer window?
Well, all I can say is there's a lot cleverer people than me at FIFA, Emiliano and others, that are doing a very good job in the circumstances. But I think, again, if I just go on the flexibility point, what I don't think can be discounted is if, for example, there may be the requirement for significant movements of capital. It might well be that, for example, there are a number of clubs in financial need to receive transfer fees, and that redistribution of income becomes very important at certain times. So I just wonder whether, again, in the interests of flexibility, that although we understand that, and I know that the Premier League, for example, has gone back to the window finishing at the end of, the potential window finishing at the end of August, because they didn't want the window to conclude by the time the season, they wanted the window to conclude previously by the time the season started. My view perhaps is that what may happen for this, if not a few windows time, is for the window to go on to a particular point in time whilst the season is already underway, and it might be even a little bit longer into the season. Now, does that potentially cause some issues with players transferring whilst playing for a particular club and then playing against their club a couple of months later that they were previously at? Quite possibly. But again, these are all constructs that can be changed accordingly. But again, I say again, the important element to also consider amongst this is the financial capital flow need, the need to ensure the integrity of the competition remains intact, and the need to ensure some type of regularity of approach. Now, I know that FIFA are looking at this in quite a lot of detail at the moment now. Ultimately, I believe the main driver for a lot of elements is to try and push back the end of the season so that the worst types of financial consequences of a lack of broadcasting deals and lack of financial monies as a result can be mitigated. And if that can be the case, just like the question you asked, Dr. Urquhart, come August, and that most of the seasons, please God, might have been able to be concluded by August or September time, then people can look ahead to what system they can put in place for that transfer of registration. And if that flexibility allows for a longer open registration transfer period, then I think that has to be something to be considered.
Thank you. And just another question. It's slightly off topic, but I think you have a lot of interesting insights to share on this as well. It's from another FBA candidate of ours, Stefan Buskovic. He's asking whether an extension of the season due to the COVID-19 could impact the sponsors that a team plays with. For example, your Nikes and Adidas of the world, if they're due to expire on the 30th of June, what would happen if they have to play matches in July?
Yes, and there's this exact situation with Liverpool FC at the moment. So you'll have seen the dispute with New Balance about their matching rights provision. And one of the elements that has come as a result of that is that because New Balance's deal is reported to expire on the 30th of June, with Nike taking over as a result, there was certainly a question mark over whether, if Liverpool were and any other team were to continue the season after July the 1st with a previously expired kit deal, whether that team would be playing in the new apparel manufacturer rather than the old apparel manufacturer. So it seems, at least from the reports as to the Liverpool Nike New Balance issue, is that that Liverpool won't necessarily be wearing the Nike kit from the 1st of July onwards. But again, it brings into play lots of difficult issues. It might well be, for example, that if, for example, the season is being able to be extended, but the sponsorship deal is only until a particular period of time at the end of the season, depending on what the wording says, it might well be that a club needs to get a new sponsor in for that particular period of time. There are a number of clubs throughout Europe that don't have shirt sponsors for next season, and the likelihood of that being a possibility because of all of this uncertainty is pretty high, especially when sponsorship and marketing budgets are almost certainly going to be at least slashed in the short term, unless some forward-looking brands are looking for these possibilities to help support clubs and other types of institutions. In
your personal opinion, first of all, do you think all the leagues should be terminated, whichever the time frame? And second, how do you think COVID-19 will have a permanent impact in the football world? What do you think will never go back to the way it used to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've talked too much already, so I'm going to say very brief. I'm going to say, yeah, hopefully the season will be continued to a close. And I just think more philosophically, I think the world will change after this. I don't think it's necessarily just football. And I think one of the things to consider is maybe the escalation or the increase in the way that people are consuming content. I mean, all of us didn't really know about Zoom until about 3 weeks ago, never mind use it. Now it's an infinite part of our day-to-day world. So I would say, yeah, I think there's going to be significant changes to the way that life is carried out post-COVID. But I think this is, we're here for the long ride on here. I'm not sure there's any short-term easy solutions.
Thank you, Daniel.